everyone. We don't have any announcements, but we are going to do a little review, right? Because did everyone have a nice holiday? Okay, well, it was just like, I guess it's time to move on past the holidays. Let's do this. So, all right, so we're going to do our review of chapters 1 through 4, and then we're going to jump into chapter 5. So, open up your Bibles, pull out your observation worksheets, however you want to look at Hebrews tonight. Put that in front of you. So, who wrote the book of Hebrews?
We don't know.
We don't know. Right? But what do we do know about whoever it is that wrote the book of Hebrews? How did they hear the message?
From those who had been with him.
From those who had been with him. Right? So, not an apostle themselves. We know this rules out Jesus, but they heard it from one of the apostles who had heard it from Jesus. And is it written to believers, non-believers? To who is it written to?
Believers.
To believers. How do we know it's written to believers?
They're thinking of leaving.
Okay, there's all these encouragements about don't turn back, don't drift away, doing all those kinds. The weeds, okay? And a lot of times what we've seen is that the authors refer to them as brethren, right? And we see in the language that this is particularly important because the book of Hebrews, what is the purpose of the book of Hebrews?
To show that Jesus is better than a bunch of stuff.
Okay, that's the theme is to show Jesus, consider Jesus your apostle and high priest. But remember the author says, but I wrote this book as a word of encouragement, right? So the purpose of the letter is exhortation, encouragement, and do you remember what phrase that we looked at that we see this over and over, that he's encouraged or they're encouraging and exhorting them? You remember the phrase? Lima. Therefore, and let us, right? Therefore, let us, right? Just we see that phrase over and over again. And so what is the cultural background probably of these people?
Jewish.
Jewish. Now, how do we know that it's probably Jewish? Okay, well, it says letter to the Hebrews.
That's the first one.
Yeah, okay, but when it was sent to this group of people, it didn't say on the envelope, letter to the Hebrews, right? That was the name that the church gave to it. But what, just looking at the content of the letter, why would we think that it was written to a primarily Jewish audience?
Because it has a lot of Old Testament references, a lot of things that
Yes.
go back and know. You have to be Jewish to know.
Right, it has a lot of reference back to things that only Jews would understand and that they would know, right? Now, does the author have a particular writing style? So when you look at other epistles in the New Testament, how do most of them start?
Greeting the brethren.
Yes. To so-and-so, peace, grace, love, from so-and-so, to the saints, here and here and here, right? Is that how Hebrews starts?
No.
No. How does the author of Hebrews start Hebrews?
Why did it stop? Why God?
Yeah, he just jumps right into it, right? From verse 1, right? So we see that it's unique in its structure and the person's style in how they write it.
It's like notes on a sermon. Notes on a
Almost.
sermon.
Yeah, it's just, there's no really any kind of niceties or anything like that. It's just like, let's just jump right into the topic, right? Now, does the author, though, utilize a particular writing style? Is there something that we saw that he uses over and over to convey a point? Chris?
He teaches like the rabbis do.
He teaches like the rabbis do, right? And we saw that he uses a style of from lesser to greater. Remember? So this over here, he'll say, okay, this was good, but this is better, or this is greater, or something like that, right? And he's going to continue doing that in the next few chapters as well, right? So In chapter 1, when the author starts out, what is the point that the author makes in verse 1 of chapter 1 that basically he develops for the next 4 chapters? God has spoken, right? And he says that God spoke first through who? Through the prophets. In the time of the fathers, he spoke through the prophets, but now he has spoken through who? His son. Now, remember we talked about this, it's really interesting because he doesn't give us a name to the son anywhere in chapter 1, right? He just says that he has spoken through his son. Now, who is the son? What does the author say about this son? Why should we listen to this son?
He's an exact representation of the character of God.
Yes, he's the exact representation. He has the same character and nature. He is the appointed heir of all things. He's actually the one through whom all the world was created. He upholds everything by the word of his power. And he accomplished something. And then because of that being completed, he sat down at the right hand of the Father. And what was it that he accomplished?
It's verse 4.
Our
Become much better than the
purification.
angels because he procured our salvation.
Well, the purification of sin, right?
Right?
Okay, so we see that this is who this son is, that he's done all of these things. He somehow procured this purification for humanity. He's now sitting at the right hand of the Father, which implies what?
Power.
Power, equality, authority, right? So we see this equality with God the Father that this son has. Right now, who does the author go on then from that moment and say this son is better than
Angels.
these angels? Now, why did the author start with angels?
The Jews revered angels.
Yes, and angels are created, and part of their function is to be what?
Servants.
Messengers. The messengers of God, right? Now, what was the name that was given to this individual that no angel has ever had?
Son.
Son, right? And so the author, he says in verse 5, for to which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Now, what does the name son convey? Why is it, what does this name imply?
Inheritance.
Yeah, it's a name that can only be awarded by God the Father, okay? It conveys with it this idea of heir, but is it a name of status? Does this idea convey purely a chronological birth order or something like this, or is this a title of status given to this being?
It's a title of status.
It's a title of status, right?
There is, clearly there's no birth order because he wasn't born. He's been forever. Right, it talks about it right after here, but.
Right. But we're going to talk about the incarnation in a few chapters, but right now he's just talking about who this person is, right? And so, what do we see that in light of who he is, how do the angels respond to this person? What do the angels do regarding this person? They worship him, right? Now, the Son then, when we look at verse 8, the Son is also, we're told something else about the Son. What are we told in verse 8 that he is?
God.
Okay, well, he's God. He says, your what? Throne, O God, right? So God the Father says this of the Son, that he is God. But what does all of this throne and scepter kingdom language, what does that all tell us?
And he's ruling.
He's ruling, he's sovereign, right? He's sovereign over this kingdom. And how is this kingdom ran? Is this kingdom ran well, or is he a despot? Is it lawless? Is it
Righteous.
any of those? It's a righteous
Righteous.
kingdom, right? So then he moves on to the next thing that he tells us. So we have this Son, then we have the Son identified as an eternal sovereign, that his kingdom will last forever. Then in verse 10, what are we told about this Son? He's not only an eternal sovereign, but he's also what?
Creator.
The eternal creator, right? And this is where the author says that everything of creation at some point in time is going to do what?
And
It's gonna end. It's gonna be rolled up like a cloak, right? But what about the creator? He will remain, right? Everything else will come to an end, but your eyes will not come to an end. So then the author asks the question, to which of the angels has God ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? And the answer to that question is none, right? Okay, so in chapter 2, remember we have warnings, we have instructions, we have exhortations. What do we see the phrase, for this reason, in verse 1 of chapter 2, referring us back to what? To what we've just seen in chapter 1,
Yeah,
right?
he's superior to angels.
Yeah,
Yes.
that God has spoken through his Son, right? And so what we saw is that the author starts laying the foundation that this Son is better than the Old Testament prophets. This Son is better than the angels. And what is the warning that the author gives us because of that in chapter 1? What does he say that we need to do?
Not drift.
Yeah, to pay much closer attention to what you have heard.
Which I find, I know we're getting there, and when we get to chapter 5, we're gonna, there's some parallels here, because it's talking about obedience and not drifting. There's a lot here that comes into play.
Yeah, now remember, what does it mean to pay attention?
Focus on
To
it.
focus on it, right? Because what is the warning here? But if you're not paying attention, if you're not intentional, what's gonna happen to you? You're gonna drift away, all right? And then he talks about that if the word that was spoken by God earlier to the nation of Israel through angels, if that carried a penalty for drifting away, what is the understanding about these things that have been spoken about Jesus? Can we escape a judgment if we don't pay attention? If the nation of Israel couldn't escape judgment when they didn't listen, can we escape judgment?
No.
No, right? So then the author goes through and he talks about how he came to understand the message, that it was spoken, after it was spoken the first through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard. And he makes a statement then in verse 5 now of kind of starting to segue into something else that this person has done that he's been talking about in chapters 1 and the beginning of 2. And so what group does he bring in now in verse 2 to talk about their priority in God's perspective? Look at verse 5. For he did not subject to angels the world to come, concerning which we are speaking. But one has testified, some were saying, what is man that you remember him? Right? So who does the author introduce into the discussion now, talking about the Son and creation and paying attention? Who does he introduce? Humanity, right? And what did we see about how God feels about humanity in these verses? Does God care about humanity? Does humanity have supreme favor in God's eyes?
Yeah.
Yes. Does humanity have special privilege in God's eyes? Is humanity gifted with a unique dignity from God? You
7
have
and 8 are
crowned
awesome.
him, yeah, you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have appointed him over the works of your hands. And who has unrivaled dominion regarding this earth?
We do.
We do, right? But there's a problem that we don't see all of these things subjected to us. We don't actually see humanity functioning in this way. And we talked about that the reason that we don't see humanity functioning in this way is because the author is laying out for us the original intention of how God wanted humanity to function. But why is it that we don't see this anymore? Do you remember when we talked about this? How did man, in a sense, corrupt his purpose? The fall. Remember? And we talked about how the fall changed all of that. And the author goes on and he says, we don't see humanity functioning in the way that God originally intended for them, but in verse 9, but we do see him who was made for a little while lower than the angels, namely who? Jesus. Right? So now we have a name to this son. Right? So he's better than the prophets, he's better than the angels, and he has been made for a little while lower than the angels. And what has happened to him?
Suffered death.
Suffered, and as a result.
He suffered death, yes.
Yeah, and as a result,
Right?
in fact, the author of salvation through suffering.
Okay, so he says, because of the suffering of death, he's crowned with what? Glory and honor, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Right? So what we see here is that the author introduces this topic of suffering in connection to Christ. Okay, now, I want you to think about this as we continue to go on here through this. Because we talked about in chapters 1 through 4 that the author drills down on a particular time frame in the history of the nation of Israel. And do you remember what time frame he particularly focuses on? In the wilderness generation, right? So what we see, he focuses on, and we looked at this in our overview, he focuses on that first generation that came out of Egypt. And when we get to chapter 5, we're going to see that he focuses on the religious component that part of Israel was introduced to. He takes us back to what theologians talk about as primitive Judaism. What it was that God told them in the very beginning, right? Now, what I think is really interesting is what we're going to see now as the author starts moving into this discussion of who Christ is even more fully. What he really focuses on is the crucifixion and resurrection. He doesn't really talk about the things that Jesus said to people during his ministry. He doesn't really talk about, well, Jesus said this when he was in the temple. He doesn't say anything like that. What he really starts to focus on is what he introduces right here in verse 9, this suffering of death. Right? And what that suffering of death brought to Christ is that he's crowned with glory and honor. What we saw, what was really amazing about this is that God allowed Christ to endure this, because the next phrase, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. It was an act of grace for him to allow this to happen, and that through this act, that grace would be offered to everyone. Right? So he says that's kind of how the author this is how he expands who this son is and what this son has done. Now, this act of the suffering brought about, he says it's offered to everyone. And what was the outcome of this act in verse 10?
Bring sons to glory.
Yeah, to bring many sons to glory, right? And to perfect the author of their salvation. Now, remember the word perfect here means what?
Completion.
Completion, right? And author, in a sense, means source, right? So this act of Christ's crucifixion carries with it a unique outcome, right?
Right.
Okay. Now, to further clarify what he's talking about, what does he tell us about Jesus in verse 14? what event does the author talk about here? Okay, if he talked about the crucifixion previously, what does he talk about in 14?
Incarnation.
The incarnation, right? He says, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same. So now we see the incarnation, the necessity of the incarnation, that through death, right, he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and might free those who through the fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. Now, this unique work applies only to who?
Jesus.
Okay, Jesus is the one who does it, but it applies to who?
Only to human
Human.
beings.
Only to humanity.
Yeah, I get your question, yeah.
Okay? It doesn't apply to angelic beings, it applies to the descendants of Abraham, right? Now, because he became flesh and he suffered this death, the author says what in verse 17? Because of all of this, he has been made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful
High
what?
priest.
High priest.
High priest. Right? Now, what is he a high priest regarding? Where does he function as a high priest? What does he function to do as a high priest? Is it just, hey, you need to be nice people?
No,
You know,
he cleanses us from our sins.
Right, but he functions as a high priest in pertaining things to God, right? So his priesthood is connected to the work of God and the redemption that God has planned for humanity, right? But he functions as this high priest as a merciful and faithful high priest. To anyone who wants to take advantage of that work, they're allowed to do it because his death is what brings about this, and that work that is accomplished through his death is open to everyone, right?
Right.
Yes? No? Okay. Now, what are we also told about this high priest? In verse 18, why is he merciful? Why can he function as a merciful high priest?
Because
Okay, for he himself was tempted in that which he suffered. He is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. Right now, did you notice here that how many times the author in these verses regards a specific event that he ties to something that Christ has done, and that event has accomplished something? And it is the event where he suffered.
correct. He does bring that up a lot.
Okay? It's the event where Christ suffered. Right? And that's what I was saying. As we really go back and we read this, right? He was tempted when he suffered. And I want you to pay attention to that because I think that's going to help us understand some passages in verse 5. But it talks about that he has suffered, and so he can understand our own temptation, he can understand our own suffering, and because of that, the author starts then in chapter 3, he says, therefore, how does he identify them? Holy brethren. Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of what? A heavenly calling. Do what? Consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of your confession. Right? Now, we talked about this earlier. The apostle carries with it the understanding of someone who is a messenger, someone who speaks for God. Right? But what we're going to see is that the high priest is someone who acts for God. So you have considered Jesus, this person who speaks for God. So if he speaks for God, you need to what? Listen, you need to pay attention, but the author's going to start developing this idea that he also acts for God. So when the author talks about this idea of to consider Jesus, what does he mean by that? Is this an intentional thing, or is it, like this morning over the holidays, I think we we can consider things off and on and, periodically, like, I may consider with the fourth or fifth cookie that I've eaten that at some point in time I'm going to have to actually put on real clothes again, right? Something that actually doesn't expand. But I might consider that for a moment and then just do what? Eat another cookie,
Yeah.
all right? Is that what the author is talking here about considering Jesus?
No, he's talking about.
No.
Take him seriously.
Seriously, this is an intentional seriousness about what we know and we understand about Jesus, our high priest. Because he's faithful to God in all things. Now, the next comparison in chapter 3 comes with who? Moses. Now, why does the author bring up Moses?
Because he was somebody who was really important to Jews.
Yes.
They thought that he was next to God himself.
Right, when it came to the greatest spokesperson for God, who was it? Moses. All right? Now, did Moses follow God well?
Yeah.
Yes. Did he trust God completely?
Yeah.
Was he faithful to everything that God told him to do?
Almost everything.
Almost everything. But when you look at Moses, was Moses someone who was lackadaisical about his relationship with God, or was he very intentional about his relationship with God? Very intentional and very responsible in what God had called him to do. Is that how we see Moses? Right. So, with all of that being said, the author says, even when you look at the example of Moses, he was still considered only a what?
Man.
A servant in the household. But the son is what?
An heir.
An heir and over the household. Right? So we see this distinction of Moses. Moses was a great prophet. And he did what God had called him to do. And he did it well. But when you put him beside Christ, Christ is much better. Right? And so he brings up then, he starts talking about this wilderness generation, who as Moses was leading them, and he was speaking to them for God and all of this kind of thing, what was the problem that they had continuously?
Hard hearts.
Hardened hearts,
Lack of
because
trust.
they wouldn't do what?
They wouldn't obey.
But they wouldn't listen.
They wouldn't listen.
Right? They wouldn't listen. And this is what the author says in verse 7. Therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness. Now, we talked about this quite a bit. What was the problem with that generation that was brought out of Egypt? They were stiff-necked. They were stubborn. Was their problem a lack of information?
No.
No.
Was their problem a lack of experience?
No.
No. But what did they never do?
Trust God.
They never trusted God. Right? And he would do these amazing things, and they would just see them, and then a few days later, a few weeks later, a few months later, they're grumbling and they're provoking God and they're doing all of these kind of things. And because they wouldn't trust God, what did God say about that generation?
He couldn't enter the promise.
They provoked him.
They couldn't enter his rest. Right? That they were not able to enter the rest. Now, after the author makes that statement, and he tells us that in verse 12, he says, take care, brethren, that there not be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. That idea, remember we talked about unbelieving there is apista, which means the opposite of trust. It's an untrusting heart. Right? So we understood there's a difference between someone who knows about God, who has maybe experienced some things of God, and one who truly trusts God. Right? And this was the problem. But what's the encouragement in the next verse?
Encourage each other.
But encourage one another. Right? How often are we supposed to encourage one another?
All the time, daily.
Day after day, as long as it's still called a day. And what is the instruction? so that none of you will be what?
Hardened.
Hardened by the deceitfulness of sin, right? Now, what is the encouragement in verse 14? For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our assurance until when?
The end.
The end, right? So today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me.
So life application here though in 14, actually 13, encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called today. What's that look like in the day to day? I mean, I thought about that a lot myself. I'm asking you, I'm asking the group. I don't know if there's any specific answer, but that's something that we really need to be.
There is a specific answer here. Now, in light of the context, what was the problem with the nation of Israel? What would they not do?
They would not listen, they would not hear, they would not do.
Okay, but what was the root problem? Yeah, they wouldn't listen, they wouldn't obey, they wouldn't do. But why would they not listen? Why wouldn't they obey? Why wouldn't they do?
They didn't trust God.
Because they didn't trust. See? And this is what the author's talking about. We need to encourage one another day after day to trust God. To trust him. To take him at his word. To believe what he says that he will do and who he is and what he's done for us. And to trust him, even if I don't see the outcome of something, that I trust him because I know who he is. And that's what the wilderness generation could not do. They were never able to do that. And so he says, because of this lack of trust, you will not enter my rest. Now, remember, what did we say that rest is not?
It's not salvation.
It's not salvation. Right? Because we understand that it cannot be salvation, because who did not get to enter into the promised land? Who was God's
Moses.
greatest prophet?
Yeah.
Was Moses. Right? And he's barred from entering the promised land because of one event where he doesn't trust God and he misrepresents God before the people. Now we see that as a harsh punishment, but his responsibility was to encourage the people to trust God. Right? So we saw that rest is not salvation, but rest is something that is obtained by trusting God. Right? And that's what the author talks about in verse 4, or in chapter 4. He says, therefore, let us fear if while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. So it's the encouragement here that just as the nation of Israel needed to trust them, these Jews who were possibly thinking about turning back from Christianity to go back to Judaism, or to create some kind of hybrid Judaism, Christianity kind of thing, what does the author tell them not to do?
Don't do that.
Go there.
Don't do that. Right? You need to enter the rest that comes through trusting Christ. Right? Now, so we saw this about the rest and we looked at this, but now what we understand is that we're going to start now at verse 14, because when we stopped in November, this is where we stopped, was at verse 14 in chapter 14. Okay? So are we up to speed on everything? Everybody's brains rebooted and we're all good?
Sure.
Well, as good as they can be tonight. Okay. All right. Now, remember, the author's already told us something about Christ as our high priest. You remember in chapter 2 what he told us about Christ as our high priest? He's a merciful and faithful high priest, right? He can identify with our condition because he was tempted in his suffering, and so he can identify when we're tempted, right? So then, in verse 14 of chapter 4, the author says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. Right, now, what is our confession? Because this isn't the first time the author's talked about this confession, right? So what is our confession? Yes, it's the things that we hold dear regarding Christ. That he is the Son of God, that he came in the flesh, that he died for our salvation, that he rose because of our eternal life, and he has ascended and sits where? At the right hand of the Father, right?
And he's coming again.
And he's coming again, right? This is what Paul laid out in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that this is the gospel message, right? So he says that, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with he says, so since we have this high priest who's passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast that confession. Now, before we move on, what word has he used in regards to the high priest that we need to pay attention to see that he's starting into another lesser to greater comparison?
The great
A great high priest, right?
the greatest.
So the question is, who is Christ going to be compared to now as high priest? Okay? And so what we see is that that's what starts in chapter 5, right? But the introduction of the discussion is in verse 14. So he goes on and he says, why do we need to hold fast this confession? For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things yet as we are, yet what? Without sin. Because of that, therefore, let us what? Draw near with confidence, where? Why?
So we receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need.
To help in time of need. Right now, the question is, when is the time of need that the author is talking about? When we're tempted. Right?
Right.
So this is what the author's talking about. So we have this faithful high priest, this great high priest, who has been made like us. He has experienced the things that we experience, so therefore he can do something on our behalf, and so we can enter into the presence of God without any fear, with confidence. Now, what does it mean when he says, let us draw near with confidence? When you read that word, how do you see that? What do you think that the author is implying? Because confidence can be a lot of different things, you know? So what does he mean? How do we draw near with confidence? What makes it possible for us to have this confidence?
That we've already been accepted, that we can walk to him as his accepted sons or daughters and walk right into the throne room and say, you know, and have that confidence, not that shrinking away that it talks about in other areas of the Bible.
Okay, now, do I come before God in confidence of anything that I have done?
No.
Okay, so this morning I was telling everyone, it's like, you know when you get invitations to something and they ask you if you want to bring a +1, right? When we come into the presence of God, we are Jesus's +1, right? The only reason that I can even come into that environment is because of what he has done. Now, I can come in there with confidence, but I don't come in there entitled. I don't come in there demanding. I don't come in there as like a petuous toddler, all right? I realize that the only reason that I'm welcomed in that environment is because who I'm with, right? But think about this, talking to Jews. This is a new concept that they could actually come in, that they themselves could come into the presence of God. Because who was the only person who was allowed to be in the presence of God in the Old Testament system? The high priest. Right? Now, so, chapter 5. Now, before we go on, let me ask you a question. What is a priest? right? Because a priest is not unique only to Christianity and to this discussion. When you look back at the Old Testament, you have the priests of different cults, you have the priests of different religions. What is the purpose of a priest?
To represent the people in front of God. Or
Okay,
to the God.
okay, so the priest had a dual function, right? They represented the people to God or the God, but then they also represented the God to the people, right? So a priesthood was like this middle ground of how people came into a relationship with someone, right? So when we get to chapter 5, now the question, like I said, the question is, who or what priesthood is Jesus going to be compared to now? If he is the great high priest, what priesthood is going to be the lesser?
Levitical.
The Levitical priesthood is going to be the lesser, right? So he says, for every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. Right now, turn over to Exodus chapter 28. Because what we're going to look at is when this priesthood was established. Right? So, in Exodus 28, we're going to start in verse 1. Now, remember, Exodus 28 happens when? So, kind of put it in a time frame, right? If you look at Exodus, in Exodus 20, let me kind of give you Exodus 20 as a half one, right? Exodus 20 is when God comes to the people and he speaks to them from the mountain and he gives them the law, right? And when that's all over, what do the people say?
We'll do whatever they say.
But what did they say first?
Don't let them talk to us.
Yeah, we don't want to talk to God anymore. Moses, you go talk to God for us. All right? So what does Moses go do? He goes up on the mountain and he talks to God, and he comes back with the 10 Commandments and with all these things, and he reads it to the people, and then what do the people say?
We'll do whatever he says.
We'll do everything that God said, right? And Moses said, are you willing to go into a legal binding agreement with this? Will you go into covenant with God for this? And what do all the people say? Absolutely, we will, okay? Then Moses is called back up onto the mountain after they go into covenant with God, and he's there for 40 days, right? This 40-day time frame is when he gives all of the instruction about the building of the tabernacle, all of the articles of worship that are to be constructed, the priesthood, everything he gives in that 40 days to bring back down to the people, right? So this is in that same time frame as when God speaks to the people from Sinai. Okay, so in verse 1, he says, then bring near to yourself Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the sons of Israel to minister as priests to me. Okay, so what are Aaron and his sons going to do?
Minister as priests.
Okay, and what does a priest do?
He's the intercessor.
Moderate between God and man.
Moderate between God and man, okay, on both sides. Okay, remember, on both sides, right? So it says, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, Ithamar, Aaron's sons. You shall make holy garments for Aaron, your brother, for glory and for beauty, and you shall speak to all the skillful persons who I have endowed with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him. So what are these garments supposed to do for Aaron and his sons?
Set them apart.
Set them apart, right? So when you're looking out over the people, you can identify who's priest by what they're wearing, right? That he may minister as a priest to me. These are the garments which we shall make, you shall make a breastplate and an ephod, a robe, a tunic of checkered work, a turban, and a sash, and they shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother and his sons, that they may minister as priests to me. They shall take the gold and the blue and the purple and the scarlet material and fine linen. Okay, now, whose line is only given the priesthood? Only Aaron's line. It's very clear, right? Aaron, your brother, and his sons. Right? So this priesthood, even today, there is no restored Aaronic priesthood. Okay? Because the priesthood comes through Exodus, it can only come through what family? Aaron's. Right? So in verse 6, God said, they shall also make the ephod of gold, blue and purple and scarlet material, and fine twisted linen, the work of a skillful workman. It shall have 2 shoulder pieces joined to its 2 ends, that it may be joined. The skillfully woven band which is on it shall be like its workmanship, of the same material, of gold, of blue, of purple and scarlet material, and fine twisted linen. You shall take 2 onyx stones and engrave on them the names of the sons of Israel, 6 of their names on the one stone, and the names of the remaining 6 on the other stone, according to their birth. As a jeweler engraves a signet, you shall engrave the 2 stones according to the names of the sons of Israel. You shall set them in filigree settings of gold. You shall put the 2 stones on the shoulder pieces of the ephod as stones of memorial for the sons of Israel, and Aaron shall bear the names before the Lord on his shoulders for a memorial. You shall make filigree settings of gold. The 2 chains of pure gold, you shall make them of twisted cordage work, and you shall put the corded chains on the filigree settings. Okay. What is the purpose of these stones in the ephod?
Represent the tribes.
Yes. But do you see the language? That Aaron shall bear their names on his shoulders. Okay? So when Aaron comes before God, he's bearing the weight of the people before God. Right? He's shouldering the burden of the people. So that's what his first purpose is as priest. Then in verse 15 it says, you shall make a breastpiece of judgment. Now, how many times when we talk about the breastplate do we put in the phrase of judgment? Right? The work of a skillful workman, like the work of the ephod, you shall make it of gold, of blue, and purple and scarlet material, and fine twisted linen you shall make it. It shall be a square and a folded double, a span in length and a span in width. You shall mount on it in 4 rows of stones, right? And then you have all these precious stones that each stone identifies a tribe of Israel. Then it says in verse 21, the stones shall be according to the names of the sons of Israel, 12 according to their names. They shall be like the engraving of a seal, each according to his name for the 12 tribes. Now, jump down to verse 29. Aaron shall carry the names of the sons of Israel in the breastplate of judgment over his heart when he enters the place, for a memorial before the Lord continually. You shall put in the breastpiece of judgment the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be over Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. Aaron shall carry the judgment of the sons of Israel over his heart before the Lord continuously. So what did the breastplate represent?
The judgment
The judgment of God
on the people.
on the people. Right? And this was carried where?
Right over his head.
Right over Aaron's heart. Right? So when he came before the Lord, he bore the weight of the people, but he also recognized that the people were deserving of God's judgment. And he bore that over his heart. Right? And both of these things represent Aaron ministering on behalf of the people to God. Okay? Now, go down to verse 31. And you shall make the robe of the ephod olive blue. And then jump down to verse 35. It shall be on Aaron when he ministers, And in the rest of the verses, it talks about the pomegranates that are engraved around it, the little bells that tinkle whenever Aaron walks. And it says, it shall be on Aaron when he ministers, and its tinkling shall be heard when he enters and leaves the holy place before the Lord, so that he will not die. You shall also make a plate of pure gold, and shall engrave on it, like the engravings of a seal, holy to the Lord. You shall fasten it on a blue cord, and it shall be on the turban. It shall be on the front of the turban. It shall be on Aaron's forehead, and Aaron shall take away the iniquity of the holy things which the sons of Israel consecrate with regard to all their holy gifts, and it shall always be on his forehead, that they may be accepted before the Lord. Right now, in other places, this piece, this plate, is referred to as the crown. Right? Now, what's on this crown though?
Holy to the Lord.
Okay, now, who is that statement made about? The high priest. Aaron is holy to the Lord. Because what does God say about everything that passes through Aaron's hands becomes what?
Holy.
Holy. Right? So what you see here is that in how God designs the priesthood, he designs it with Aaron bearing the responsibility of the people on his shoulders and his heart. On his head, though, the people are to see continuously that Aaron himself is dedicated to the Lord, and he ministers on behalf of God to the people. So anything that they give to Aaron, that Aaron then offers, becomes holy. Anything that passes through Aaron's hands becomes consecrated to the Lord. It's like they were actually putting it in God's hands. Right? And so what we see is that God very clearly lays out both aspects of this priesthood. Now remember, could any family do this?
No.
No. It was specific to Aaron and his line alone. Right? Then God goes on in verse 40, and he says, and Aaron's sons, you shall make the tunic, you shall also make sashes for them, and you shall make caps for them, for glory and beauty. And you shall put them on Aaron your brother, and on his sons with him, and you shall anoint them, and ordain them, and consecrate them, and they shall serve me as priests. You shall make for them linen breeches, of which they are to cover their bare flesh, with they shall reach from the loins even to the thighs. They shall be on Aaron and on his sons when they enter the tent of meeting, and when they approach the altar to minister in the holy place, so that they will not incur guilt and die. It shall be a statute forever to him and to his descendants after him. Right? So, what have we seen laid out in chapter 28?
How the priest is supposed to be clothed.
Okay, how the priest is supposed to be clothed, the symbology behind a lot of those articles, right? Those particular regalia that the priest is supposed to wear, there's a symbology behind that, right? There's a meaning behind it. But now the question is, how do Aaron and his sons become consecrated, set apart, holy to the Lord, to serve him in this capacity? And that's outlined in Exodus 29, right? So in verse 1 it says, now this is what you shall do to them to consecrate them to minister to me as priests. Take 1 young bull and 2 rams without blemish, and unleavened bread and unleavened cakes mixed with oil and unleavened wafers, spread with oil, and you shall make them of fine wheat flour. You shall put them in 1 basket and present them in the basket along with the bull and the 2 rams. Then you shall bring Aaron and his sons to the doorway of the tent of meeting, wash them with water. You shall take the garments and put on Aaron the tunic and the robe of the ephod, and the ephod and the breastplate, and gird him with the skillfully woven band of the ephod. And you shall set the turban on his head, and put the holy crown on the turban. Then you shall take the anointing oil, and pour it on his head, and anoint him. You shall bring his sons, and put tunics on them. You shall gird them with sashes, Aaron and his sons, and bind the caps on them, and they shall have the priesthood as a perpetual statute. So you shall ordain Aaron and his sons. Okay, so this was the ordaining of them or the anointing of them. But that doesn't consecrate them. Right? So then the next things that they do is how are they consecrated? So then God tells them in verse 10, you are to bring a bull before the tent of meeting, and Aaron and his sons shall lay their hands on the head of the bull. You shall slaughter the bull before the Lord at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Right? So the very first thing they do is this bull. This bull, the text tells us in verse 14, but the flesh of the bull and its hide and its refuse you shall burn with fire outside of the camp. It is a sin offering. Now, when you look at all of these offerings that God is going to outline for the nation of Israel, some of the offerings are voluntary offering, some are mandatory, right? Sin offerings are mandatory. Because what the sin offering does, it atones for the sins of the person offering it, and it cleanses from defilement. So before Aaron and his sons can minister on behalf of God to the people, what has to be taken care of inside of them, of their own? Their own sin. Right? So the first thing that is offered is a sin offering to cover their sin and take care of their sin. The next thing in verse 15 is one of the rams. And the rams are, and it says in verse 18, you shall offer up in smoke the whole ram on the altar. It is a burnt offering to the Lord. A burnt offering is a voluntary offering. It's a volunteer, you give it voluntarily. It's not one that can be demanded necessarily. And a burnt offering, what this represents, the burnt offering, is the idea that it is a voluntary act of worship to express our devotion, to express devotion to God or commitment to God. But it is also used to recognize that there are sins that I may not even know to confess, and I'm asking for those sins to be forgiven. Right? So it's a sacrifice given to show commitment, to show involvement and devotion and worship, but it's also given to express and understand that this is given because of these unintentional sins that I may not understand. So when that ram is given, what are Aaron and his sons agreeing to?
What are they agreeing to?
Yeah. If it's a voluntary offering, and it represents a commitment or worship to God or a serving of God voluntarily, what are Aaron and his sons agreeing to?
To serve God.
To serve God. Voluntarily, to be devoted to God, to serve Him in the function that He is calling them to serve Him in. And recognizing that as they come to serve God in this way, that there can be sin that there may be that they don't even recognize as sin. And asking God to take care of that. Right? So then we have the bulls done, we have the first ram done, and then what they do is that they take the second ram in verse 19. Then you shall take the other ram, and Aaron and his sons shall lay their hands on the head of the ram. You shall slaughter the ram, and you shall take some of its blood and put it on the lobe of Aaron's right ear, on the lobes of his sons' right ears, and on the thumbs of their right hands, and on the big toes of their right feet. And sprinkle the rest of the blood around the altar. Then you shall take some of the blood that is on the altar and some of the anointing oil and sprinkle it on Aaron and on his garments and on his sons and on his sons' garments to him. So he and his garments shall be consecrated, as well as his sons and his sons' garments with him.
So something I've thought about a lot over the years, every time I read this, it sounds to me like, he's really clear in chapter 24, whatever it is, about how you're going to build the high priest's garments, and it says for holiness and for beauty, right? But then the chapter later, he's saying, but flick a bunch of blood on that.
Okay, so we talked about this morning, all right? Okay, now, so now the purpose is given for that, right? So if you look at this, the bull and the first ram represent the consecration of physically Aaron and his sons. But what are they going to wear into the presence of God?
They're
Clothes.
garments.
So anything that comes into the presence of God has to be what? It has to be consecrated, right? So now, I think sometimes when we think about sprinkle, all right, because when I think about sprinkle, and I used this example this morning, when my grandkids make sugar cookies, it's always interesting because when I make sugar cookies and I sprinkle something on a sugar cookie, I sprinkle, right? My grandkids sprinkle, right? It doesn't say that the garments are splashed with blood.
No, but you still see it.
But it's just a fleck, yes. But what does that remind you of when the people saw those flecks of blood on the garment? What did they know about these garments? They were consecrated garments. They were holy garments that were worn to serve the Lord. And everything that comes into the presence of God has to be consecrated.
This is how we know OxyClean was invented before us.
Yeah, okay? So, but I think this is an interesting thing. And not only their garments, but their ear, their
toe.
thumb,
And
their toe, that they hear God, they
Okay.
serve God, they follow God, and they are willingly committing their lives to all of this. Right? And then what you see is that then a peace offering is offered. A peace offering is a voluntary offering as well. And this whole process is then finished as the peace offering is given with the wave offering or the heave offering. Right now, just fun fact, the difference between a wave offering and a heave offering is that the wave offering was the grain, that you just kind of waved it. The heave offering was the meat, right? Because you've got a pretty large piece of meat here that you're picking up and you're waving it before God. So it was more of heaving it up instead of just like waving some flour and some wine in front of God, right? But they're the same thing, they just applied it, one's meat, one's wheat, right? So you go through this whole process, and when this whole 7-day ritual, right? It takes 7 days to consecrate Aaron and his sons. At the end of that 7 days, they are able to do what at that time?
Go and approach God.
They are able to go in and approach God. They are able to minister for the people to God, and they are able to speak for God to the people. Right now, what would happen though if someone just decided and determined that they were going to take the priesthood for themselves? Do we have any example at any point in time of the wilderness generation of someone who had been chosen by God to serve him, decided that, you know what, anybody should have the priesthood?
Yeah, Aaron's first 2 sons.
Dothan,
Oh, yeah.
and
well,
yeah,
yes.
remember you have in the wilderness, they're wandering around the wilderness. One day a couple of Levites decide, well, who made Aaron and Moses rulers over us? Right? And they come to Aaron and Moses and they say, you know what? We're all equal. We're all holy before God. We are a holy congregation. And who they're talking about is the tribe of Levi. Because what had been the gift that God had given the tribe of Levi, because they had stood for God at the mountain? That they would serve God, that they would be the tribe who was allowed to serve God and to minister to the people. And what does God say about this? It's not what I said, right? And what does God, now I was thinking it's interesting because when Moses and Aaron first bring this to God, what does God say? Stand back, I'm just gonna kill them all, right? Okay. Now, but what do Moses and Aaron do?
They pray.
They pray and they intercede on behalf of the people before God, remember? And they say to God, are you going to destroy the righteous along with the wicked? And then God says, no, but tell these two men that they are to stand before me tomorrow, and if they die a natural death, then I am not God. Right? So what you see in that text is that you have the story then of the Levites coming, part of the Reubenites who have come, basically 250 men come, and they come and they're given censers to burn their censers and all of this kind of thing, and God says, I'm going to choose who is my priest, right? And what happens to the rebels? This is one of the most amazing stories. This is why you always read the book of Numbers, okay? When they come, what happens?
The earth opens up and swallows it.
Ground opens up, they go into it, their family go into it, the animals go into it, everything that they own, and the text says that they go to Sheol alive. Okay? And then the ground closes up. And then the judgment on those who were with them comes out of the tent of meeting, and fire comes out of the tent of meeting, and all of the 250 who were with them are incinerated, and all that is left are their censers. Okay, now, what do you think of that story?
That's not a good horror movie.
Yeah, really.
Okay, see, I find that story horrifyingly amazing. Now, the reason I do is because at that point in time, it is very clear who God has chosen as a family to serve him. And there was no reason that the nation of Israel should ever have questioned that. So the next time in 100 years, 150 years, when some teenage son is doing something and they say, well, I don't know why so-and-so, just because his great-grandfather's Aaron, he gets to do what he does. I think we all should be able to do that. What is his dad going to tell him?
You better watch what you're saying, buddy.
Okay, let me tell you what happened when somebody else did that years ago, right? So what we see is this judgment on them, and then, though, the question is, what family will serve God as priest? And what does God tell all of the tribes to do the next day? Bring the staffs, right? And each tribe designates a family that will represent them. God says the line of Aaron, the family of Aaron will represent the Levites. Bring the staffs, put them in front of the holy place, and in the morning, you'll see who I choose because their staff will have budded, or sprouted, is what it says. So they do that. The next morning when they come in, what do they see?
Sprouted olives, the whole deal.
Aaron, yeah, it's above sprouted. It's sprouted, it's bloomed, it's produced olives, it's done the whole thing. And so what is made very clear by God when it comes to what family can serve him as priest? Aaron's family, right? So what we see is a tribe who rebels against what God says. What would have happened if a king were to decide that he could function as priest? How would God feel about that?
Saul didn't do that.
Not good.
Well,
Right?
even with Miriam, you know, Miriam was like, well, you're no better than us, and God gave her leprosy for a moment there to
Right.
show her, I'm not messing around.
Imagine that.
Okay, so what we see is that we have this questioning of who speaks for God that God very quickly judges. But what happens when you have a king years and years and years later, as they're established in the nation of Israel, and he's even a king that follows God? Uzziah. Uzziah is a godly king. But one day, what does he determine? Yes, not only can I be king, I can also be priest. Okay?
Then he wasn't a godly king.
Okay, but it says in the text that he was a godly king.
Well, when he makes that decision, doesn't that
Okay,
kind of negate
well,
that?
no, it's a bad decision. Okay?
A really
It
bad
doesn't, it's a really bad decision, right? But up until that point he does. And basically, what was Uzziah trying to do? What had God very clearly divided? Church and state, in a sense. What was Uzziah trying to do? He was trying to bring about something that the king could act as priest before God, which was common among the nations of the pagans, right? And so he comes in, he brings a censer in of incense, he's gonna burn incense before the Lord. Now, I think this is what's really interesting. He's not even gonna slaughter something and try to burn it on the altar. He's just gonna try to do an incense sacrifice. And what do the priests say? Get out of here, you better get out of here. What do you think you're doing? Get out of here, you cannot do this, Uzziah. You know you can't do this. And as they are talking to him, what does God do? Leprosy from head to toe. And they're frantically trying to get Uzziah out of the temple, because a leper, what will that do to the temple to have a leper in the temple? It defiles the entire temple, right? And the text tells us that from that moment on, that Uzziah lived isolated and he was never able to go into the house of the Lord again, right? So what we see here is that God takes very seriously who speaks for him as a priest, right? So, going back to chapter 5. Any thoughts before we move back to chapter 5? Okay, so, in verse 1, for every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself is also beset with weakness. Now, what does this idea of his besetting weakness imply?
That he's not perfect.
Yeah,
That he needs to make a sacrifice for himself as well as the people.
as well as for the others. Now, but what were we told about Jesus in regards to weakness?
Suffered temptation, he understands us.
He understands, but there is no weakness in him. All right? So what the author said, that condition that we all have, which is that sin nature that we all have, the priests had that as well. They had that weakness that they, remember, that's why they had to be consecrated. Christ, though, as a high priest, does not have any of that weakness. He was tempted, yet without sin. Right? So then it goes on. And because of the high priest's weakness, he is obligated, or he is required, the needs require him to function in this way, to offer sacrifices for sins, as for the people, also for who?
Himself.
Also for himself. Right? Because he's what? He's a sinner. Right? So it says, and no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called as by God, even as Aaron was. Now we get the greater to lesser. Right? Christ is the great high priest. Aaron was the original high priest. And in a sense, he's the one who maybe and possibly serves greatest in that capacity to God, because he dies faithful and all of that kind of thing. But even in light of Aaron and how he served as priest, it still is lesser than how Christ serves as high priest. And now, what the author goes on and he says, so also Christ. Right? So now you have a comparison to Aaron. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you, just as he says also in another passage, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, we're going to flesh this out a little bit more in a couple of weeks. But what we see here is that just as the name was bestowed upon Christ as Son at the incarnation, God is the one who appoints Christ as what? High priest. He does not take that role to himself. He is appointed on behalf of the people. Remember, every high priest is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God. Right? But what's really interesting about him, and this is what the author is going to flesh out in a little while, can he serve in the line of Aaron?
No.
No, because Christ is not of what tribe? He's not a Levite and he's not of the line of Aaron, right? So now it's interesting, the author pulls back to an even pre-existing priesthood before the Aaronic priesthood that we're told about in the time of Abraham to Melchizedek, right? And we're going to look at that. Now, the order of Melchizedek means within the character or the nature of Melchizedek, right? So now we have what priesthood, now, at that point, I bet the readers, because I know what I do, I'm like, who the heck is this Melchizedek? Why are we talking about Melchizedek, right? So we're going to look at that and wow. But what he very clearly specifies is that Christ is a high priest, but he cannot be the same as Aaron because he doesn't fall into the guidelines of the family that has to have that high priest. So therefore, he has to be a greater high priest, but in the order of someone else. And that is Melchizedek.
Yeah, someone that came before.
Someone who came before Aaron,
Right.
okay, who was a priest. And we're told that he was a priest, right? So, he says, so also Christ did not glorify himself to become a high priest, but he said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you, who appointed him a spokesperson. Just as he says also in another passage, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. He is now given this work to do to Jesus. And then he specifies something that is really interesting here. Right now, he says, in the days of his flesh. So when is that? So the author is taking us to a particular time frame. In verse 7. In the days of his flesh.
So it would have been in the incarnation, but specifically during this part, they're talking about during the crucifixion because he's.
Okay, is it the crucifixion, right?
It's prior.
Okay, so let's kind of deconstruct this for a second. In the days of his flesh, so in the incarnation, right? He, Jesus, offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his piety. Now, the word here for prayer is entreaty that someone brings to someone to help them, right? It carries with it a desperate need, right? It's an entreaty of a desperate need. Supplication is someone recognizing that they are a supplicant to someone, and they come in that posture of being a supplicant.
What does that even mean?
To be under the authority of someone, right? So think of kingdoms, all right? So when you came to a king, right? When you came into the presence of a king, you came into the presence of a king as a supplicant. That you came in understanding that the king had authority, the king had power, the king had the ability to do whatever you came to ask him to do, but at some point in time, as this, what you recognized that basically as a supplicant, you would do whatever the king said to do in the end. Right? That the king knew the plan, the king understood the plan, and this is what it was. And so a supplicant would come in peace. They may have a request of the king, but they understood that whatever the king said is what would be done. Now, do you think the author is talking about a specific event where Jesus is praying, he's entreating the Father, he comes in supplication with loud crying and tears to the one who is able to save him from death?
Yeah, that would have been in the Garden of Gethsemane as he's praying and doesn't want to go through this, but
Yes.
will do what God says.
Exactly. The prayer is there any other way? Let's take this cup. The supplication is, whatever your will, not mine. Right? But Did Jesus struggle in that moment? And do you remember a few verses back we saw, and he was tempted in the things he suffered. Okay, so when was the moment of Christ's greatest temptation? Gethsemane. Okay,
Understandably so.
see? Understandably so, right? Now, see, this is what I think is really interesting. Because what you see is that, because for something to be a temptation, it has to be something that you're questioning, right? This is what I think is so interesting about the wilderness. It's a temptation in a sense, but really, Jesus doesn't even entertain the idea of doing anything that Satan offers him. Says, no, you know what? We live by the word of God. Nope, not going to do that. And finally, he's just like, you know what? Go away. Just quit bothering me. All right? Nothing that Satan offers him does he even consider as an option, right? But in the garden, right? This is where you see that questioning. But in the end, he does what is needed, right? And it says that he was heard because of his piety, because of his reverence for God, because of his willingness to follow God. God heard him, but did it change the outcome? What was he still told? This is the only way that this can be done, right? So, this is what I was talking about. That the author starts focusing in on this suffering aspect, this weekend of the trial, the garden, the crucifixion, all of that. Now, because of that experience in the garden, when you and I come to Jesus in those moments that we're tempted, what can he say to us?
He actually can sympathize.
He can sympathize with it, right?
But I have thoughts on this though, because here we know absolutely that Jesus is fully God, and the Trinity is awesome. How that all works, but we know that the Trinity had predetermined that this death was that Jesus was going to come in
And
his
he
humanity,
knew the
and this was
plan.
going to happen.
Yes,
So
yes.
that whole stupid song where it says, and Jesus, and the Father turned his face away. No, he did not. He was
did
part
not.
of it, and it
He's
was all
part of
part
it,
of the
he's
whole
watching
deal.
it, he's doing all of that kind of thing.
But what I do, and I think what it is that he's actually so human while he's completely God, that there's that moment where, he knows. This is the plan from eternity. This is not something that's negotiable. But man, that flesh is pulling hard, and he's in the flesh.
Okay.
Man, I don't want to do that. I don't.
Okay.
But then it says later in Ephesians, for the joy set before him. So
Right.
there's a lot going on here.
Okay, so I'm going to share a personal story here, all right, that may help with kind of the understanding of this. Okay, one day I meet this handsome young airman, has hair, arms to die for. He had these glorious muscles, all right? And he talks me into marrying him after 6 months dating, right? And I'm like, okay, fine, whatever, yeah. So we have our wedding rehearsal the night before we get married. It is horrendous, right? It's not very good. Our families don't really get along very well. We go to a restaurant, and for some reason, Ken orders a fish stew, which the man doesn't eat fish hardly at all. And he gets it, and he looks at my burger, and he says, do you want to trade? I don't like this. And I'm like, no, you ordered it. I'm not. I leave that night going, what have I agreed to? It was like, do I really want to do this? Okay? And the whole next day, I go get some candelabras, a guy rear ends me, I end up rear ending another car. It's just horrific.
You should have known better.
And I remember my dad, as we are standing at the back of the church, ready to walk down the aisle. This is what my dad says to me. He turns to me and he says, Rena Jo, we can walk out the door, you do not have to do this. Okay? And I thought, I don't, but I agreed to this. I knew this is marriage. I agreed to this. And so I walked down the aisle, right? But there was that moment when the temptation was there because the door was right there. I think we didn't even have to really, nobody would have even seen us exit the building. It would just have been that everybody would have been waiting, you know? But see, I think that this is what you see in the garden. Had Jesus planned the redemption of humanity? Absolutely. He was part of the planning. He was part of the implementation. He knew this was the end. He came to show us the love of God, and this act was the culminating of the love of God for humanity. But it didn't make it easy in his flesh because he had lived under Roman authority for 33 years. He knew what a crucifixion looked like. He knew what happened to people before they were crucified. He knew the brutality. He knew. And so he asks, and he's tempted. But what does he ultimately do? He goes through with it. That's why it can be said, yet without sin. And so because of that, God hears him, the Father hears him, he listens to him because of his piety, because of who he is and what he's about to do, but it doesn't change the outcome.
Man, doesn't it just make you love him all that much more?
Yes, it does. And then the author goes on and he says, and although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. Now, we have to be careful how we interpret this verse, because is the verse saying that there was a time when Christ was disobedient? No. There was never a time when he was disobedient. Or the statement could not be said that he was without sin. Right? So the word here for learned is a really interesting word because it's not really the acquiring of new knowledge in the Greek. But it carries with it an understanding of enduring a challenging process that transforms us that cannot be understood until we go through the process. Does that make sense? That I can know something theoretically over here, right? And I may understand what it looks like and what it's going to entail and do all of that, but I don't truly understand it. I haven't truly learned it until I go through the process. And this is what the author is conveying. That through that learning, going through that process, when the Father said, he didn't say we're going to change it, that Christ learned, he experienced what it means to be totally compliant to the will of God in the flesh. So when I come to him and I say, you know what, this is hard, I don't want to do this. I don't think this is going to work out well. I don't think it's to better me in any way, shape, or form. I think that God is mistaken here. I really would like to get out of this trial and this tribulation and all of that kind of thing. And I come to him and I say that because of what he experienced and because of what he learned in the flesh as he was going through that process, what can he say to me?
I've been there.
I know how you feel. But what I'm telling you is to trust. Be compliant and trust. Right? And that's how he's a merciful and faithful high priest. Right? And so the author goes on and he says, and having been made perfect. Now remember, what does the word perfect here mean?
Complete.
Complete. Right? He has completed the task that has been set before him, and having been made complete in what he was sent to do, he became to all those who obey him the source of what?
Eternal salvation.
Eternal salvation.
There's a lot to pick out right here as well.
Okay, well, we're not going to pick because we're going to pick some more at it next week,
Okay.
right? But Do you see how important it is, this understanding, in light of who the people are and what Christ has done, the proper understanding of the high priest and the priesthood is? Now, let me just kind of throw a seed out there for you to ponder and let it kind of germinate in your brains, okay? And we're going to talk about this, and the reason I'm going to throw it out there is because as we talk, we're going to talk about this in a little while. Now, in Peter, we are told that we are a holy priesthood. Believers are a holy priesthood, right? So, what does that mean that we do?
Represent God to represent the people to God, represent God and the people.
Okay, so what we do is that we pray for people, we engage people, we talk to people about their need for salvation, we do all of that kind of thing. We take these people to God, but then we represent God to those people. Now, let me ask you, is there a clothing that we wear?
Yeah.
As those priests, just as Aaron and his sons were clothed so they could be identified among the people, is there a clothing that we wear?
Yeah, doesn't it say that in Romans 14 when we just went over? You're to shed those your dirty deeds like old clothes and put on Christ.
Exactly. Right? So what you see is that now people, now I think this is what's really interesting, just as those priests could be seen among the people, are believers supposed to be seen among people?
Absolutely they are.
Absolutely.
And if they're not,
Okay.
then we have to ask, and I have to ask this myself all the time, if we're not, then are we really wearing the clothes? Are
Exactly.
we really followers?
See, so this is going to become a bigger concept that the author's going to flesh out even more as he goes on. But we may be priests, but there's only one high priest. And according to the author of Hebrews in chapter 5 and chapter 4, who is the high priest that we serve under? Jesus Christ. Okay, so next week we're going to finish up that little, what about, I wish I could tell you more about this, but you're just too immature to listen. We're going to finish up that and go into chapter 6. But any thoughts or questions or comments before we leave this part of chapter 5 tonight? Some food for thought? Yes? Okay, see, I think of what, it wasn't necessarily that people would say you're wearing it and not wearing it, but it was that if you were wearing it, you were supposed to act a certain way. So if the sons of Aaron are garbed in the priests and clothing of the priests, what should the people expect from them? Okay, so then the question is, how do we know who's wearing Christ and who's not wearing Christ? And the author's going to talk about that as well as this time. So see, he's laying the groundwork for all this really intriguing discussion about how Christ, ultimately where he's headed, is how Christ is the fulfillment of the entire Levitic priesthood and sacrificial system. So yeah. So, all right. Well, good way to start the new year.
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Well, let's pray, and we shall depart. Father, we thank you so much for this evening that you've given to us, and we thank you so much for the time that we were able to spend in your word. And Father, it is just so amazing as we see all of these dots that connect from old to new and how we play a part in all of this and what's been provided for us. We ask that as we really sit and ponder it, that we would never take any of this for granted. That we would realize who we are as your people, that we would come into your presence with confidence, that we would remember that we come in confidence because of the hand that we hold. And so, Father, we ask that you would just help us to be the people that we have been called to be. That we would be the light in the darkness, that we would be the salt of the earth, that we would be that light on a hill. And that, Father, that you would use us however you choose to use us, and that we would allow that. And so, Father, we thank you that you are a God who sees, that you are a God who hears, Lord Jesus. We thank you that you are a God who is compassionate and sympathetic to our weakness, and that you are faithful in the midst of that weakness. kindness to us. And there's just so much to ponder, so much to thank you for. And we just thank you that we have the minds that are capable to do that. So I ask that this week, that our study of your word would be fruitful, that we would look at your word and we would consume it like honey. That Father, it would just be something that we are addicted to. And that we would just ask how we can live it better. And we thank you for all of this because of your Spirit living within us tonight. So it's in the name of your Son that we come to you. And we thank you for all of it in his name. Amen.